Hello and welcome to another episode of Combat Analysis of Chivalry Medieval Warfare, where we take a look at hostile engagements, analyse them and talk about ways to improve our playstyle. My name is Marcus and I'm your host this evening. I want to do something slightly different in this episode, and because of this I feel the need to ramble a little before we get in on the action. For those of you who would rather skip directly to the actual combat, I'll leave a button that takes you there instantly. Okay, now let's get started. The first thing I want to mention, which you may have already noticed, is that I've bumped up my field of view since the last episode. From last weekend onward I've been using a field of view of 140. Prior to this I had it set to 130, and that for a very long time. I can't remember when I decided on that, but I would wager at least 3 years ago. So in all of the clips shown in this video, keep in mind that I'm still adjusting to the change in field of view, and that I sometimes misjudge distances because of it. Now on to the second thing. I want to talk about spears, as I'm using one in this episode. If you've been following this series, you'll know that I've been playing Knight exclusively up till this point. This is by far my most played class in general, and the weapons demonstrated are definitely my top choices for it. But from time to time I do end up switching to Vanguard, and there my preferred weapon for a long time has been the spear. For the purpose of simplicity, from now on when I say spear in singular, I'm referring to the weapon named spear. And when I say spears in plural, I'm referring to this particular category of Vanguard weapons, which the spear is part of, along with the fork and the brandy stock. The reason why I want to talk about this is that this category is fundamentally different from all other melee weapons in the game, in the sense that they are unable to combo. The implications of this are actually huge. With any other weapon you can continue to output damage on your opponent after landing a successful hit, by binding attacks together with combos. This means that you can trap your opponents in a whirlwind of drags, excels and feints without ever giving them a chance to counterattack, and it greatly increases your flow in the fights. With spears, however, this is not quite possible. After every single attack you will go into recovery, successful hit or not. The only thing you're allowed to do is an attack to parry at the end if you wish. For the purpose of forcing an opponent to keep on parrying your spear, you can abuse drags and excels to some extent. For instance, if you drag your first attack greatly and then speed up your next, you may be able to flinch your opponent in wind up even though you didn't combo. But comboing in Chivalry is frequently used for another thing as well, which may be even more important, and that is combo feint to parry. Meaning that after your first attack, you wind up again, quickly feint and do a parry. This is useful if you're a bit too far away from your opponent and end up missing your first attack, and your opponent senses this and goes straight for an attack on you instead of parrying. If you combo feint to parry here, you will be able to parry in time for this attack, whereas if you do not, you will be in recovery and take damage instead. CFTP can also be used in teamfights where you land a successful hit on an enemy, but need to parry quickly after anyway because an ally of his is swinging at you. Here the spears yet again fall short, and it requires you to think several steps ahead in a teamfight before making a decision to attack a guy who's open, if you want to avoid taking damage. The strength of the spears is ultimately more about the abusable reach, and in the case of the brandy stock, the high damage as well. In order to keep up a flow in the fights, despite the inability to combo, you should use the length of your weapon to your advantage and force out more feinted parries from your opponents when they swing at you from too far away. I find this is more likely to happen against newer players who don't judge distances very well, and the spears can definitely be quite effective in large teamfights where you consistently outreach your opponents. However, with that and all the drawbacks in mind, I'm not sure I would actually recommend these weapons. If you want the mobility of the Vanguard with good reach and damage, I think there are better alternatives to these weapons, such as the Greatsword, the Zweihander and the Halberd. Personally, I find the lack of CFTP to be a bit too much of a deal breaker from an objective standpoint, and the actual reason why I like the spear is simply because I think it looks cool. I just find it super aesthetic and awesome. And as a side note, it's very likely I'll be using it more actively once Mordau comes out, since combos and even stab to stab combos will be available there. Enough of chivalry theory, let's dive in and analyze some actual footage. This match was, to everyone's great surprise, played on Dark Forest, on a 24-player server, and featured a couple of notable players such as Damas, Silo and Iluvatar, who has been a friend of mine for a very long time. For both me and him this was quite a spectacular game, definitely on par with the one I played in episode 2. The other team was fairly low skill, and as such I think the strengths of the spear really came into play. And that is why I decided to take apart this particular game in this episode. In my first engagement of this game, I'm up against a whole bunch of knights. Distance is my greatest ally here, so it's best to run back. I do a subtle target switch, which does catch the left knight off guard, but the knight on the right does not anticipate my overhead. Luckily for me, he does not attack me at the same time, and I do manage to parry him afterwards. The left knight intrudes on my turn and gets flinched as a result. Then I slide in and gently finish him off without harming my ally. Nice and clean. On this knight I do a slash riposte. It's very weak in terms of damage, but virtually instant and succeeds almost every time. It is a good way to disrupt the rhythm of the fight. You want to weave together slow overhead drags with instant slash and stab ripostes, so that your enemy never gets to decrypt your style. It's a great way to force out more panic parries. The next knight panics, and I make sure to drag my overhead to make it land after his parry window. And there isn't much more to this fight. This guy can't handle this many opponents and eventually dies. The man-at-arms misjudges my weapon's length here, and we both start attacking at the same time, so I do a feint to parry. This guy fails to realize I have the initiative and gets impaled. And now I'm skipping ahead just a little bit. We finish off this vanguard pretty easily, but at the same time 2 more Agathians show up, and the brandy scores a hit on Salo. I can however make sure he does not get a second hit in by flinching him right after. A quick riposte finishes him off, but I do take a hit from the bearded axe afterwards. But then he dies and we move on to the next target. Here I have another ally with spear, and we manage to completely dismantle the knight by attacking from different angles and staying well out of range of his sword. I see the next knight approaching, circle round to dodge his attack and get a free overhead on him. Lucky for me, he doesn't take advantage of his initiative and I can score another hit on him. In the same vein, I sadly tank a throwing axe. I wind up again, but so does the brandy, and I quickly feint to parry. He does manage to parry my riposte, but then takes a hit from my ally, so I can safely kill him before the subsequent slash reaches me. And thus, the objective is concluded with me not dying a single time. Again, my opponent underestimates my reach, and he is made short work of with another feint. By the way, here's a small tip for you guys. This knight dies before my overhead reaches him, and in order to not hurt Iluvatar, I redirect my attack to the cart. The reason why this is better than hitting the air or the ground is that I don't lose any stamina. This works with corpses as well. If you're out fighting and know that you're going to miss your opponent for whatever reason, it will save you a bit of stamina if you manage to hit a body on the ground instead, or as in this case, the cart. Again, keep in mind, with several opponents in front of you, you're better off staying close to your team and not running in like a maniac. You can only attack once per turn with this weapon, and need to fight methodically. This particular fight I will play once more afterwards in slow motion, so just bear with me and watch for now. Here I do get very low as I'm attacked twice from behind. The panic parry I throw out could have been the end for me, but thankfully the rat-at-arms gets flinched in turn from behind by my spear ally. After that I play rather safe, and once the engagement is over I fall back and regenerate my health. But here I do want to join in again. This place is a perfect setting for a teamfight with spear. I can stay at a safe distance and every attack is an opportunity for me to go in. If my allies swing at them, I can follow up, and if they swing at my allies, I can counter-initiate. The walls on the sides ensure that no one circles around and cuts us from behind. The fight sort of breaks up a little, but I'm gonna continue doing what I do. Now sadly Silo gets caught in between these two guys and ends up dying. I'm not sure I could have done much to help with that. At the time of my first overhead on the Vanguard, the man-at-arms is not at all in range, so going for him instead is not really an option. After that I probably should have focused on the man-at-arms instead, as Silo was facing away from him the entire time. He may have killed Silo in time anyway, but I definitely should have tried to stop him. After parrying the man-at-arms, I target switch and finish off the Vanguard. Sadly I do take a hit from the man-at-arms, as I'm unable to see TP. But at the same time I'm clearly winning the stamina war, so I just need to keep my composure and do a couple of ripostes. Now I'm approaching my next target from behind. Since the man-at-arms is slightly elevated in regards to the archer, I can therefore decrease the likelihood of hurting my ally by aiming for the feet on our opponent when I stab. And here's a neat little trick that works quite well against lower skill players. Simply jumping towards them can often force them into a panic parry, as they associate this with attacking. It's not the cheapest way to do it, as it still costs some stamina, but it is a fun way to switch things up. I do decide to abandon my teammate here, as I see 3 Agathians approaching. I am also quite low on HP and do not want to engage several opponents. Maybe it's a bit of a dick move to run away, but I don't care enough about my allies to go into a situation that will most likely result in my death. If it's a friend of mine, it's a different story, but in this case I will leave him to die. Let's skip it forward a little. I do think this could be worth showing twice, so let's just see how it plays out to begin with. And there you have what you've all been waiting for, my glorious first death. Here I'm anticipating the Vanguard charge, so I stay idle until he passes by. I jump up on the rock because I don't want to end up fighting both the Knight and the Vanguard at the same time. But the Vanguard keeps running away, so I then decide to help out my man-at-arms instead. Generally it's not too bad to just swing back and forth with an opponent when you have an ally with you, because eventually you will outstam him. My opening overhead is perfectly fine since it also forces out a CFTP. But then I do another overhead which he riposts, I parry, and I follow up with yet another simple overhead. At this point I'm just being way too repetitive. I've thrown out 3 attacks in total and he's parried every single one. And with the last one, he did a counter riposte that took out my ally. On the third overhead, I really needed to do a feint. It would be very likely to succeed, I could have scored a hit afterwards, and so could my ally. Now with the mistake I made, my ally died instead, and at the same time a blue knight showed up from behind, which put me in a terrible spot all of a sudden. After parrying the left knight stab, I definitely should have gone for a riposte, but I think I was still a bit caught off guard and waited a bit too long to counter. By the time I wind up, the master does too, and I go for the safer play of feinting to parry. I kind of feel like the messer is engaging Silo here, so I make an effort to dodge the longsword knight and outreach him, but I get clipped at the end of the messer slash and end up dying. As you can see, it does not take much to die. The reason I've lasted this long at all is because I've been very good at selecting which fights to engage in and managed to dodge the fights that weren't looking as hot. Here we are at the start of a huge teamfight. Best thing to do here is to circle around and wait for things to unravel. Basically you just wait until someone sticks out their nose, and when they do, you punch it. Going in first is pretty much out of the question. I'm at a high risk of taking damage in recovery if I do this, as I am unable to save TP. The man-at-arms striding over the rock is a prime target. He misses his swing and I go for a hit in recovery. I kind of misjudged the distance to the shield knight, but get out of recovery in time to parry again. Another successful dodge, which results in an overhead on both of the knights. After their deaths, it's important that I regenerate stamina. But again they engage Iluvatar and I can score another hit in recovery. The reason why I stick around the spawn is not to grief the players coming out, but I want to get my health back before I push forward on the objective. You may not think I'm doing very much here, but if I can keep my opponents out of reach and keep pumping out attacks, they will, with enough iterations, eventually take damage. And they also constantly lose more and more stamina if they just parry my attacks. The spear is not the type of weapon that finishes off your opponents quickly, instead it processes them over time. And by playing around your allies you can become extremely annoying to your opponents. The entire game was pretty much just a constant skirmish, and I didn't really feel the need or have the ability to divide it into different fights. But I think this may give you an even better idea of how to work the spear correctly. My boys and I are basically keeping the entirety of Agatha at bay here, while the rest of our team is finishing the objective. Now my intention was actually not to Omega feint the archer here, but I accidentally cancelled my attack again after the first feint and had to do several more feints to force out a second parry and strike him afterwards while open. I just didn't want it to get awkward. After killing the archer I did take a hit from the messer boy, but I managed to see his follow-up reverse coming and parried successfully. He probably got knocked back much farther than he originally thought by the vanguard charge, because the slash afterwards is horribly out of reach of any one of us, and I managed to score a final overhead on him in recovery. His death marks the end of this objective, so now I'm going to skip forward to the cistern, where I basically run around for an eternity and sometimes poke people from behind. Here I'm approaching a man-at-arms at the crank, but with a quick sweep of my surroundings I spot a knight making his way towards me from behind. If I stay around here and engage the man-at-arms, I will eventually get sandwiched by the knight, and this is ill-advised. Therefore I run back into a position where I will get my opponents to converge if they both keep following me. When the knight swung here, I should have attacked instead of parrying, as he was too far away. I was just not sure at the time that he would miss and went for the safer play of parrying. This could partly be attributed to my recent increase in field of view. The second time he swings out of reach, I capitalize on his mistake and score a free overhead, but immediately after I sprint down the stairs as I see two more approaching opponents, one of which is carrying up fire pots of hell. I wasn't planning to fall down after parrying the vanguard here. I would rather stay up there and kill them both. This is what I get for not minding my surroundings. And I'm going to skip ahead to the next engagement, this one also at the crank. This is a pretty good position for us, with long weapons and all opponents in one direction. But clumsy as I am, I do poke my ally in the back. I want to follow Damas'dan as I have a pretty good chance of killing him. And I get a bit lucky, and score a free hit on an unsuspecting man at arms here. But thereafter he plays quite well and manages to read my feint. And I make the decision to quickly run over and steal a kill from Silo instead. Here we get 2 more opponents. Really the only important thing here is to not damage your allies. Team damage can otherwise get quite nasty in situations where you outnumber your opponents. More outreaching of opponents. I'm not entirely sure if I hit Ilu here, but at least I think it was clean. And afterwards I end up in a fight where I die again, but in a really stupid way. Basically I just misjudge the distance to my opponent horribly because I fall down, and as a result they just take me apart. Really stupid play by me, and I ruined the mirrored KD I had with the Luvatar. Here I run into a 200 Vanguard. As I wind up and overhead, he releases his charge, and I'm forced to feint to parry. Lucky for me he ends up missing, and this saves me a load of stamina. When I see him wind up again, I run back to dodge it, but with too great a margin, and I also end up missing my attack. But once my ally comes into the picture, this guy tries to run away instead, and it doesn't work out in the slightest. He misjudges the distance to me substantially twice over and dies. As I make it round this staircase, I spot 2 new opponents, one of which an arm's length away. He tries to swing at me and even combos, but ends it after the second attack. I take advantage of this and manage to score a hit in recovery. A feint afterwards is incredibly deadly, as it only takes 2 overhits to kill a Vanguard. And then I move on to the Knight. And I do miss a couple times. And when I eventually score a hit, I feel like backing off for a second to regenerate stamina. In the same vein, I take a bolt to the chest, which further advocates for backing off. And here Damas engages me again. But I get a little assistance from an allied Vanguard, and suddenly he is in an even worse condition than I am. Ultimately I finish him off with an overhead that he probably could have parried if his camera was facing more in my direction. And then we make our way up to the objective. And here is a textbook example of a terrible Vanguard charge. It puts him right in between me and Silo. At this point there is no direction he could be facing in order to parry both of us, and thus he ends up dying. With his death we manage to complete the 3rd objective and move on to the final stage of the map. Silo and I choose the right hand path that leads directly to the backside of the Agathian spawn. Here our first hostile contact is with a man-at-arms hot on my ally's heels. I try to poke him away, but have to be cautious so as to not further damage my ally. The trick is to drag the attack away as soon as you've made contact with your opponent, in a direction in which your ally is not. The Vanguard does panic parry after taking 2 hits and would have died there had the man-at-arms not missed. Directly after I manage to finish him off, and we all get to stay alive. Of course we do want to hit C first if possible, as it's usually not as heavily guarded at the start. But we also have more incoming enemies from behind, and better to deal with them now than later. The Vanguard, although given a lot of space, chooses to put himself in a very precarious position, just on the edge of the abyss. I make an effort to knock him down there, and he chooses not to parry. I get enough time to wind up again, but sadly miss. Lucky for me, this guy chooses to go for a feint at the same time, and I'm spared a hit in recovery. I am, however, not completely unscathed, as Silo throws an axe at me at the same time. Ultimately the Vanguard dies to stabs from Silo and another knight who swoops in and takes the kill, and stabs me in the process. I am suffering some major team damage in this fight. After the whole exchange, I want to get a bit of health back before we make our way to the objective. But the Agathians are ferocious, and yet again we have hostile contact on our 6 o'clock. I am still hesitant to attack as I have gotten my region going, and would like to get it as high as possible before I break it by attacking. But when another Man-at-Arms shows up in the other direction, we need to quickly get out of the sandwich, and I make a move on one of them. After attacking twice, I know that the other Man-at-Arms is very close, and I turn around just in time to react to his attack. He fails to block both my riposte and my subsequent overhead and dies pretty quickly. Here is another one of those times where a CFTP would have been fitting. This knight would have died for sure if I hit, but unfortunately I missed, and his silly trade ended up working out. At least bearded axe stabs don't deal too much damage. Clumsy as I am, I poke Ilu when he goes for the finishing blow, but I make amends for this by flinching the Man-at-Arms who attacks him afterwards. Here I do a target switch from the archer back to the Man-at-Arms, who is caught completely off guard and dies. I try to drag my overhead out left and around the Man-at-Arms shield, but ironically I end up missing him and instead hitting Ilu, who in the same vein dodges right into my spear. And when the vanguard comes in, I'm expecting him to miss, which is why I don't parry. This turns out to be a bad idea. I definitely need to improve my depth perception. As I tail the vanguard down the hill, a Man-at-Arms is in turn tailing me, but he swings too early and I impale him in recovery. Here I'm trying to bait out attacks from the vanguard, but I'm playing quite cautiously since I'm very close to dying. We eventually wind up at the exact same time, and then I'm forced into a feint to parry. But then he runs down towards me and misclicks or panic parries right in front of me, and I manage to finish him off while in recovery. I move on to the next target, but only manage one more attack before I'm killed by a Man-at-Arms stabbing me in the side. I didn't even see the guy before it was too late. He did, however, appear several times in my field of view long before I died, and if I had paid better attention to the rest of the fight, I could have planned ahead for him and possibly lived through the entire engagement. The next fight takes place in between Objective A and the fallen tree. Here I'm lucky I managed to outrange his kick, otherwise I probably would have fallen down into the river. What I'm actually doing here is that I'm trying to hit the knight on the right, but realize I can't do it without damaging my allies, and therefore I direct my stab forward instead. I'm not intending to hit the knight in the far back when I wind up. My depth perception is not that bad, thankfully. And the exact same thing happens here as well. I'm winding up for the knight on the right, but end up dragging it in the direction of the knight in the back, so as to not harm my allies. And by the way, if this fight still hasn't convinced you that shields are terrible, I don't know how to help you. Here my life is cut short out of nowhere. What happened was that I took an arrow for 90 damage right as Iluvatar swung, and his slash managed to finish me off. Coming right up is another shield knight, just postponing his impending doom. And around the corner is a Man-at-Arms. I don't think I've talked about this mechanic before, so I'm gonna go over it real quick in case you don't know. Basically, if your opponent is holding up his shield and you do a heavy kick on him, meaning that you press and hold the kick key, he will get staggered, similar to a stamina burnout state, and you will be granted one free attack on him. I take one hit from a Man-at-Arms behind me, but we still manage to kill him pretty quickly, and move on to the objective. God, this game was actually full of these shield knights. I'm gonna have to make a video on that topic one of these days, so people will stop using them. Got another vanguard charging in, so I strafe out to the right to get ready and attack them. but just as I get into position, I spot the second vanguard approaching, and since I don't want to get hit by his charge, I stay idle until I see him swinging, and then I go in for a hit and recovery. Here I outrange the incoming knight. A bit clumsy of me to misjudge the distance here and get hit by the mace. I really thought he would be out of reach again. But as you can probably tell, the game is nearing its end here. We've pretty much been steamrolling them the entire time, and now there's only one objective left. Once we're outside again, we run into two more opponents. Unfortunately, Silo dies again, but I managed to score a hit on the vanguard after the killing blow. Then he goes for an inefficient trade and bites the dust. Ilu and I chase down the man-at-arms, and the vanguard is seemingly a bit salty as he makes an attempt to kick me off the server. He could have just asked for a lesson instead. We cower behind the spawn until we get our HP back, and then make an attempt on the final objective. This is pretty much the last engagement of the game, and as such we're also approaching the end of this episode. On the way down the hill we run into Damas. I wind up an overhead, but a little too early and am unable to reach him. He in turn goes for a feint, which I fall for, and as a last resort I do a duck, which ends up being successful. Ilu goes for a quick stab riposte at the same time. I follow up with an overhead, and he ultimately dies to a final stab. I'm not entirely sure why I switch weapons here, but it does force me to run out to the right so as to not get hit by the man-at-arms. Sadly, I did get a couple of artifacts on this part of the recording, and I apologize for that. Here I have quite a lot of teammates, so there's not really any need for me to hit the door. I'm better off keeping the incoming Agathians at bay. A couple more of them jump down from above. This man-at-arms panics and I get a free overhit. Then he dodges backwards, but underestimates my reach. Here I go for another man-at-arms, but in the background I spot the vanguard swinging in my direction and missing. He goes into recovery afterwards, and I seize the opportunity to kill him while he's unable to parry. I manage to parry Damas just in time, and after that I feint and overhead. Then Ilu comes in again to give me a hand and finish him off. Here I end up dying again because I take an overhead from the spear, then a hatchet from the other direction, and panic parry in response. At that point I'm completely open and to no one's surprise end up dead. The vanguard pretty much appeared instantly, and I had a very hard time planning ahead for his incoming attack. After this I respawn and run down to the objective one last time. But upon my arrival the game ends cause an archer of ours takes out the last member of the king's family. This game was, as I stated in the beginning, quite spectacular. I spent very little time being dead and was pretty much fighting the entire time. I have to say that I'm getting a bit tired of this map. It's still great to play on, but editing video after video of Dark Forest is a bit tiring. I promise it's going to be a while before I make another one. In the next episode I'm planning to dive a little deeper into actual 1v1 rather than team modes. It is different in many ways, slightly less dynamic in my opinion, which is why I mostly prefer to play and analyze team modes. But recently I have been doing slightly more duels, maybe because I felt I was finally good enough for it, or maybe because the game is dying and there is nothing else left to do. Either way, I think it could be an interesting and entertaining episode, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching this episode of Combat Analysis. I hope you enjoyed and hopefully even learned something. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of these. If not, maybe we'll just meet on the battlefield instead. That is where the real magic happens after all. Alright, break us out.